The dust hung in the air like a curtain of gold. It was October 1974, somewhere in the California desert, on the set of a Western that would later be forgotten by everyone except those who were there that day. The sun beat down on the weathered wood facades, on the cameras, on the 50-odd crew members who had been working since dawn. Clint Eastwood stood in the center of the set, rehearsing a scene. He was in his element. The tan hat, the worn vest, the squinting eyes that had made him a legend. At 44, Eastwood was Hollywood's most bankable star, the man with no name. Dirty Harry, a man who spoke with bullets, not words. The assistant director called for quiet. The cameras rolled. And then, from the edge of the set, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, moving through the dust with a kind of arrogance that made people turn and stare. Someone was walking onto the set, during a take, without permission, without invitation. The footsteps stopped, the cameras kept rolling, and Clint Eastwood's jaw tightened in a way that everyone on that set recognized as danger. Because the man who had just walked onto his set uninvited was Marlon Brando. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who these men were. Not the actors, not the movie stars. The men beneath the legend. Marlon Brando was God, not a god. The god of acting, of cinema, of an entire generation's understanding of what performance could be. He had given the world The Godfather just 2 years earlier. Before that, A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, Last Tango in Paris. He was method. He was truth. He was the actor other actors studied like scripture. Clint Eastwood was something else entirely. He was the cowboy, the cop, the man of few words and decisive action. He didn't study. He didn't prepare. He didn't do 20 takes to find the emotion. He showed up. He hit his mark. He said the line. He moved on. Efficient, professional, cold. To Brando, men like Eastwood were everything wrong with Hollywood. Pretty boys with guns who thought squinting was acting. To Eastwood, men like Brando were pretentious frauds who confused self-indulgence with art. They had never worked together. They had never even been in the same room together. Until that afternoon in the desert, when Marlon Brando walked onto Clint Eastwood's set like he owned it. The crew froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 50 people watched Marlon Brando walk across the dusty set, straight toward the cameras, straight toward Clint Eastwood, who was standing perfectly still in the center of the frame. Brando was 50 years old, but he moved like he was 30. He wore a brown leather jacket over a black turtleneck. His hair was swept back. His eyes were hidden behind dark glasses. He looked like a man on a mission. The assistant director stepped forward, hand raised. "Mr. Brando, we're in the middle of—" Brando didn't even glance at him. He walked past like the man was invisible. His focus was entirely on Eastwood, on the cowboy, on the man with the gun on his hip and the squint in his eyes. Eastwood still hadn't moved, but his hand had dropped to his side, near the gun. Not on it, just near it, the gesture of a man who was ready. Brando stopped 10 feet away. He pulled off his sunglasses, his eyes locked onto Eastwood's. And for a moment, the desert, the cameras, the crew, all of it disappeared. It was just two men, two legends, two completely different visions of what it meant to be great. And then Brando smiled. It wasn't friendly. "Still playing cowboys?" Brando's voice carried across the set, loud enough for everyone to hear, mocking enough to draw blood. The crew sucked in air. Someone in the back muttered, "Oh, God." A camera operator started to lower his equipment, like he was preparing to run. Eastwood didn't blink. His face remained absolutely neutral. The squint, the slight tilt of the head, the look that had stared down outlaws and killers and corrupt cops in a dozen movies. But this wasn't a movie. "Is there something I can help you with, Marlon?" Eastwood's voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Brando laughed. It was a theatrical laugh, the kind that fills a stage. "Help me?" "No, Clint. I don't need help. I was just curious." He gestured around the set, at the wooden buildings, at the cameras, at the crew. "I wanted to see how you do it, how you make believe you're an actor." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Around the set, people exchanged glances. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Marlon Brando had just insulted Clint Eastwood to his face, on his own set, in front of his crew. And Eastwood still hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even changed his expression. But something shifted in the air, something dangerous. Clint Eastwood took one step forward, just one, but it was the kind of step that made Marlon Brando's smile falter. "You walked onto my set." Eastwood's voice was still quiet, but every syllable carried weight. "You interrupted my work. You disrespected my crew." Another step. "And you did it because you think your name gives you the right." Brando's jaw tightened. Behind him, someone on the crew grabbed a grip's arm, holding him back from stepping forward to intervene. Eastwood raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, his index finger extended, pointing directly at Brando's chest. Not touching, just pointing. But the gesture was more threatening than any gun. "Let me tell you something about actors, Marlon." Eastwood's voice dropped even lower. The crew leaned in to hear. "Real actors don't need to announce themselves. Real actors don't need to prove anything. Real actors show up, do the work, and let the work speak for itself." His finger moved up, from Brando's chest to his face, inches from his nose. "You walk around Hollywood like you invented acting, like the rest of us are just playing dress-up while you create art." Eastwood's eyes burned with cold fury. "But you know what I see when I look at you, Marlon?" Brando's face had gone pale. The color drained from his cheeks. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Eastwood leaned in, close enough that only Brando could hear the next words. But in the silence of the desert, everyone heard them anyway. "I see a man who's so afraid he's lost his talent that he has to tear everyone else down to feel like a god." For 3 seconds, Marlon Brando said nothing. His eyes, those famous eyes that had shown the world what pain looked like, what rage looked like, what broken humanity looked like, were wide with something nobody on that set had ever seen in them before. Fear, not the acted fear of a performance. Real fear, the fear of a man who had just been seen through, completely, totally, by someone he had dismissed as nothing more than a cowboy with good looks. A crew member standing near Brando later told the story to Entertainment Weekly. "Marlon looked like he'd been shot, like Clint had reached inside his chest and pulled out something he'd been hiding his whole life. I've never seen a man go that pale that fast." Brando took a step back. His hand came up, defensive, but there was nothing to defend against. Eastwood hadn't touched him, hadn't threatened him, had just spoken the truth in a voice that cut deeper than any fist. And then, from the edge of the set, a hand grabbed Brando's arm. It was Bobby Dalton, Brando's driver and assistant, the man who had driven him out to this desert in the first place. Bobby had seen the whole thing, and he knew it needed to end. "Mr. Brando," Bobby said quietly, urgently, pulling at his arm, "we should go. Now." Brando didn't resist, didn't argue. He let himself be pulled backward, away from Eastwood, away from the pointing finger, away from those cold eyes that had just destroyed him, without raising a voice or throwing a punch. But before he turned to leave, Brando managed to find words. 5 of them. Weak, defensive, pathetic. "You don't know anything about—" "Get off my set," Eastwood interrupted, still quiet, still controlled, final. Marlon Brando turned and walked away, the same path he'd entered, through the dust, past the crew, past the cameras. But this time, he wasn't walking with arrogance. He was retreating, and everyone knew it. Bobby Dalton kept his hand on Brando's arm the whole way, guiding him like you'd guide someone in shock, which in a sense he was. Behind them, the crew remained frozen. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They just watched as one of the greatest actors in history was escorted off a movie set after being verbally destroyed by a man he'd come to mock. When Brando reached his car, a black Lincoln parked at the edge of the set, he finally pulled away from Bobby's grip. He turned back one last time, looking across the desert at the set, at Eastwood, who was already back in position, ready to continue the scene. "He's going to pay for that," Brando said quietly. But there was no conviction in his voice, no anger, just emptiness. Bobby opened the car door. "Mr. Brando, maybe we should—" "Drive." Brando got in the back seat. "Just drive." The Lincoln pulled away, dust trailing behind it like a funeral procession. Back on the set, Clint Eastwood adjusted his hat, looked at his director, and said two words: "Let's work." The cameras rolled. The scene continued. And within 10 minutes, it was like Marlon Brando had never been there at all. Except everyone remembered. Everyone always would. The story of why Marlon Brando showed up that day would take years to emerge. Pieces came from interviews, from gossip, from people who knew both men and understood the deeper currents running beneath Hollywood's glittering surface. It started at a party 6 months earlier, a typical Hollywood gathering where actors, directors, and studio executives mingled under expensive chandeliers and pretended to like each other. Brando had been there, holding court in a corner, surrounded by admirers. And the subject of Clint Eastwood came up. Someone trying to make conversation mentioned that Eastwood was the highest paid actor in Hollywood now, that westerns and cop movies were dominating the box office, that serious actors were struggling while action stars were thriving. Brando had laughed, that same theatrical laugh he'd used months later in the desert. "Eastwood," he'd said, loud enough for half the party to hear, "that kid with a gun. He's not an actor. He's a prop that says lines." The room had laughed, not because it was funny, but because when Marlon Brando speaks, you laugh. But Eddie Murphy was at that party, young, hungry, watching, and he never forgot the moment. Years later, he'd tell the story on talk shows. Marlon had this weird hatred for Clint. It was like visceral, like Clint represented everything Brando thought was wrong with movies. The story spread, as stories do in Hollywood, and eventually it reached Clint Eastwood, who said nothing, did nothing, just filed the information away, waiting until Brando gave him the opportunity to respond. What happened in that desert in October 1974 changed things. Not obviously, not dramatically, but in the small, invisible ways that shape careers and legacies. Marlon Brando, after that day, stopped talking about Clint Eastwood, stopped making jokes, stopped dismissing westerns and action movies as beneath serious artists. When journalists asked about Eastwood in interviews, Brando would change the subject, or claim he'd never said anything negative, or simply walk away. He never explained why. But people who were on that set knew. They'd seen something break in Brando that day, a kind of protection he'd built around himself, a belief in his own superiority, shattered by a man who spoke fewer words but meant every one of them. Eastwood, for his part, never spoke about the incident, not in interviews, not in his autobiography, not even to close friends. The people who asked him about it got the same response: a slight smile, a shake of the head, and silence. But the story spread anyway, through the crew, through Hollywood, through the industry, and it changed how people saw both men. Brando, the god of acting, had been reduced to human size by a cowboy with a gun. Eastwood, the action star, had proven he had more depth and intelligence than anyone gave him credit for. The balance of power, subtle but real, had shifted. Today, both men are gone. Brando died in 2004. Eastwood continues at 94, still directing, still creating, still proving that real talent doesn't need to announce itself. But that day in the desert lives on, in the stories people tell, in the lessons young actors learn, in the understanding that greatness comes in many forms, and sometimes the quietest voices carry the most weight. The crew members who were there that day are old now. Some have passed, but the ones who remain tell the story the same way, with a kind of reverence, because they witnessed something rare. They saw two legends collide. They saw arrogance meet humility. They saw noise silenced by truth. And they saw Marlon Brando, the greatest actor of his generation, walk onto Clint Eastwood's set uninvited and leave it defeated by nothing more than honesty spoken in a quiet voice. Years later, a young actor asked Eastwood about the incident, about what he'd actually said to make Brando turn pale. Eastwood, in his 80s then, smiled that slight smile. "I just told him the truth," Eastwood said. "The truth is the scariest thing you can hear when you've been lying to yourself." And that, perhaps, is the real lesson of that October day. That talent without humility is just noise. That legends are made not by how loudly you proclaim your greatness, but by how quietly you prove it. And that sometimes the man with the gun and the squint understands more about art than the method actor who never stops performing. Marlon Brando walked onto Clint Eastwood's set uninvited, and he left something behind in that desert dust. His illusion of invincibility, his belief that his name gave him permission to diminish others, his fear exposed to the light. Eastwood's first words didn't make Brando turn pale because they were cruel. They made him turn pale because they were true. And the truth, delivered by the right person at the right moment, is the most powerful weapon in the world.